Have you ever seen that photograph of a car driving through a tree? Or those California forests that look taller than most city skylines? Well, as amazing as these images are, they only represent a fraction of what once was. So let's start with the basics. Redwood National Park is located on the California coast of the Pacific Ocean. It's named after the coastal redwoods because of the reddish color of wood. These are the tallest trees in the world, and with its 216 square miles, the park protects 45% of existing redwoods. The park also protects grasslands, cultural resources, and 37 miles of pristine coastline. And the trees you saw in those iconic photographs, well, they come from another time. In fact, coastal redwoods live on average for 600 years, with some living over 2,000 years, making them one of the longest living organisms in the world. And their thick, protective bark makes them particularly resistant to disease. These trees prefer steep terrain, slightly inland and near water sources such as rivers and streams, and they're among the fastest growing trees in the world. In September 2006, the tallest tree in the park, Hyperion, was measured at 379 feet. Two others, Helios and Icarus, are 376 and 371 feet tall respectively. But there is much more to the story, because as I said earlier, what we see here today is only a fraction of a much greater forest that has since disappeared. Let me explain. In 1850, the ancient redwood forest covered more than 2 million acres of the California coast. The northern part of this area was originally inhabited by Native Americans who in fact had been forced off their land by gold prospectors and loggers. The giant redwoods attracted the loggers to support the gold rush in the southernmost regions of California, and the population growth due to the development boom in San Francisco and other places along the west coast. It wouldn't be until after the First World War, in 1918, that the first efforts were made to preserve the forest. And what it took to get there is simply mind-boggling. So with that in mind, with its millennia of history and more recent struggle for preservation, let's have a look at what once was and what remains. This is the story of California's lost redwood forest. I'm your host Ryan Sokesh, and you're watching It's History. Our perspective today starts around the mid-19th century, when the area of what became Northern California was inhabited by several Indian tribes. Some scholars estimate that at least 15 tribal groups inhabited the area, belonging to the Yurok, Cholula, and Tolowa peoples respectively. The Yurok had the largest population according to an 1852 census. The Cholula occupied the central region of the Redwood Creek Valley and were very attached to the redwoods. The Tolowa inhabited what is now the Jedediah Smith State Park, an area inhabited for over 8,500 years. The redwoods were essential to these people. They'd harvest the wood and turn it into planks that were used for boats to navigate rivers, as well as houses. The latter were made by laying the planks side by side and tying them to wooden beams with leather straps. The gabled roof was also made with redwood planks. Obviously, because of their fundamental role in the lives of these tribes, redwoods were also considered very important on a religious level. The Cholula elders, for example, believed that the members of the tribe were somehow connected to the spirits of the redwoods. And the Yurok believed that the trees were living beings, and that the redwoods contained the remains of divine races that existed before humans. These areas remained uninhabited for some time, until an expedition led by Jedediah Smith, a European-born American explorer who discovered the redwood forest in 1828. Setting out from San Jose with a small party of about 20 men, he explored the Trinity River as well as the Klamath, crossed the coastal parts of the redwood forest, and began trading with the indigenous tribes. This initial equilibrium was soon disrupted by the California Gold Rush, a period that began in 1848 and ended in its most important phase a few years later in 1855. But it served its purpose, as this event was enough to bring hundreds of thousands of Europeans and Americans from the East Coast to the West. As I trust you recall from previous videos, in 1850, a large gold deposit was discovered along the Trinity River, and this led many to settle within the areas around the forest. This also led to a difficult relationship with the native tribes, and the conflicts that ensued resulted in many tribes being displaced, enslaved, and massacred. By the end of the 19th century, only a third of the Yurok remained, and by 1919, virtually all of the Cholula had been wiped out or assimilated into other groups. Even the Toloa, who numbered around 1,000 in 1850, had been reduced to 120 by 1910. The occupation of the land also had a major impact on the environment during the gold rush. Redwood trees were cut down to provide timber needed to build new houses, and, most importantly, the mines, including all the infrastructure and tools needed for the work. The size of the giant trees made them valuable timber, as redwood became known for its durability and workability. Initially, axes, saws, and other ancient methods were used to fell trees. But there was a problem. It could take weeks for a team of workers to cut and transport a redwood tree. And although a week sounds like a long time to cut down a single tree, where there's a will, there's a way. The logging industry was determined to make a business of it. Or in other words, let's make an analogy that might really resonate with some of you. California's redwood forest was receding like a real man's hairline. But there's a big difference. You see, unlike those forests, with the help of our sponsor, Keeps, you might just have a fighting chance. Keeps is an online subscription service that makes it easy and more affordable for men to treat their male pattern baldness from the comfort of their own home. This discreet, affordable treatment is personalized, delivered to your doorstep, and on your schedule. As someone who comes from a long line of men with hair loss myself, I'm already stocking up on Keeps for when my day comes. And my wife, she's all in on that plan. It's also been tested and proven to work with FDA-approved treatment options. According to clinical studies, treatments offered by Keeps are 90% effective at treating hair loss and can increase hair growth by up to 35%. In addition to clinically proven treatments, Keeps offers hair thickening shampoo, conditioner, and styling pomade. So whether you're looking to slow hair loss, stimulate growth, or just take better care of the hair that you have, Keeps has you covered. This loved and trusted solution has helped nearly 1 million men keep their hair and has over 4,500 five-star reviews to back that claim. So check it out. Hair loss stops with Keeps. For a special offer to get started, go to keeps.com/itshistory or click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/itshistory. Thank you, Keeps, for sponsoring the channel. And now, back to the story of California's lost redwoods. By 1853, 9 sawmills were operating in Eureka, and by the end of the 19th century, large redwood forests were being removed. Land fraud was common, as acres of prime redwood forest were transformed from the public domain to private industry. Although some of the culprits were caught, many thousands of acres were lost to land fraud. Then, the future of the redwood forests were in further jeopardy as California's population quadrupled between 1850 and 1860. The population of San Francisco alone went from 2,000 in 1849 to 59,000 in 1855. People needed timber for houses, shops, industry, and even to build locks for the gold mines. Hence, prices for a very limited supply of timber rose from $50 to $500 per 1,000 board feet in a single year. The demand was so intense that lumber could not yet be met by the existing industry, so many ships, especially from New England, sailed to bring lumber to San Francisco, where they sold it at a great profit. But things would soon change as the importation of timber came to an end, since the coasts were too rich with redwoods not to think of using them. And from there, a more specific exploration of the west coast of the United States began, starting in Humboldt Bay, with its surrounding forests of giant trees, which was first reached by land when Josiah Gregg and his party sought a shorter supply route for the gold miners on the Trinity River in 1850. The first sawmill opened in that same year. Then, by 1854, there were 9 mills in the bay. Although only 3 years old, Eureka was producing more lumber than any other area in the Pacific. By 1859, the Humboldt Bay area was, according to a state report, the largest timber district in the state. Within 30 years, there were 400 sawmills on the north coast, cutting down some of the largest trees in the world. And to great consequence, as Eureka and the surrounding areas were put on the map for the lumber. The handsome Victorian houses were built by the people connected to the lumber industry. The banks, railways, and ships were owned by the lumbermen. Even the city's political leaders were lumber barons. Men, women, and children of all classes, nationalities, and levels of education were here for the timber. Industrial cutting, moving, and milling of trees the size of sequoia had never been done before. And so the people of this important timber region had to learn a lot and fast. And so it was. The first redwoods were felled by two men with axes, sometimes taking up to a week, but it wouldn't take long for technology to improve and devastation to unfold. The crosscut saw was considerably lengthened, with handles added at each end, but things were also becoming a bit automated when a portable steam-powered saw was developed as early as 1875. The next breakthrough in Eureka happened when a 200-pound petrol-driven drag saw was invented, only to be replaced when some brothers in Eureka developed a lighter, 95-pound drag saw. And as quantity increased, logs were moved by screwjacks and initially floated or towed to nearby rivers and bays. Horses and oxen hauled logs over long distances on slippery roads. Forest railways, though initially primitive, began to transport logs to mills. Amazingly, some of the state's very first railroads were here in Humboldt County. Sawmills were also developing. At first, they had a single blade moved up and down by a crank. Then there was the longer slash saw, which was enhanced by adding one or two more blades. And this was all very advanced technology, as the saws for cutting redwood had to be stronger and more durable than those used elsewhere. But the most significant invention in the lumber industry was the steam donkey in 1882. As you might imagine, the application of steam power and handling of larger logs revolutionized the industry in the West and beyond. The inventor was John Delbere of Delbere and Carson Lumber Company in Eureka, but his ingenuity was not limited to just one great discovery. His list of inventions was highly impactful to logging. For example, in 1860, he invented a circular saw for better cutting. In 1863, an accounting machine. In 1875, a portable steam-powered saw for felling trees. And then in 1883, there was an improved vertical reel donkey, as well as a logging locomotive that acted as a motor. And it should be noted that he was not alone in these inventions, as a host of other local pioneers also invented and adapted items large and small to get the job done. However, progress also comes with consequences, as in this process, they were also erasing what was America's most beautiful forests. However, it was most likely unavoidable, as the amount of wood that could be harvested from a single tree was enormous. Consider this. Local legend recalls that one town built an entire dance hall from a single stump. Redwood was unique in that it was not only beautiful, but also less susceptible to rot, insects, and fire. It was used for railway sleepers, tunnel timbers, and Victorian houses. Redwood rebuilt San Francisco 7 times after the fires. So there was quite the case study. For example, in the 1906 San Francisco fire, redwood houses were found to be less likely to burn, so houses rebuilt with redwood did not need permits. Redwood was used in many important projects, such as the long redwood pilings used in the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. Beyond California, redwood was exported around the world. Large local redwood lumber companies had offices and some retail yards throughout the United States. The largest redwood lumber companies in the world developed here and went so far as to build real towns. Towns like Cornell and Metropolitan in California, which were created to house and store the lumber of these companies. When the gold rush ended, there was even more exploitation, as the local population, now heavily overgrown, continued to make logging the main local economic activity. By the late 1800s, logging companies owned by East Coast investors had acquired vast tracts of lands by buying out homesteaders whose primitive farming methods could not cope with the land of giant trees. With an abundance of investment capital and growing technology, the timber companies were able to rapidly clear vast areas that had taken over 2,000 years to grow. In 1853, hundreds of ships were sailing in and out of Humboldt Bay, carrying timber products. In fact, it's been estimated that within just 23 years, there were approximately 1,100 ship transports. During the gold rush years, not only was the redwood forest severely affected by deforestation, but much of Sierra Nevada suffered a similar fate, partly due to the construction of various railroads, including the Transcontinental Line. These factors favored the development of the timber industry, which had previously been limited to the activity of Indian tribes and the few Alachthonist people who used wood for their small farms. By the time redwood logging peaked around 1890, most of the redwood forests were in private hands, and around that same time, the public was starting to notice the devastation caused by logging. But I should emphasize that the situation was impossible. As some people had already proposed the idea of preserving the forest, America's enormous demand for timber made that idea almost impossible at the time. Towards the end of the 1910s, it became clear that many ancient redwood forests were about to be cut down, and so activists looked for an argument. One was found in the association with fossil remains, dating back millions of years, a notion which provided a vital link to the past. The urgency to protect these standards was therefore not just an aesthetic concern, but a scientific one. And so the academic class responded appropriately. Paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History, joined by Madison Grant of the New York Zoological Society, and John C. Merriman of the University of California at Berkeley, founded the Save the Redwoods League in 1918. The League was established as a nonprofit organization dedicated to the purchase of redwood tracts for conservation. However, preservationists couldn't keep up. As technology evolved from steam power in the early 20th century, the efficiency and scale of logging increased dramatically. Larger sequoias could now be felled much more easily. Transport also became important in moving the massive logs. Modern locomotives replaced primitive lines. The development of chainsaws and Caterpillar bulldozers in the 1930s led to a massive increase in redwood logging. Acres of ancient redwood forest could now be felled in a matter of days. And it was the post-World War II construction and economic boom that led to clear-cutting of most of the ancient redwoods. In just a few decades, hundreds of thousands of acres of old-growth redwoods on private land were logged. By the 1960s, industrial logging had removed almost 90% of the original redwoods. The environmental and cultural battle of the 1960s and 1990s were largely over what to do with the last 5% or so of ancient redwoods left on private land. In the 1960s, Lucille Vineyard, Dave Van DeMark, and other members of the local Sierra Club chapters were instrumental in the fight to finally create a national park. But it was not until 1968 that Redwood National Park was established, protecting some of the oldest growth, unlogged redwood forests in California. However, the initial park boundary did not protect the entire watershed, and clear-cutting continued around the new national park for another 10 years. Then finally, in 1978, after legal battles and continued public pressure, the US government bought more than 10,000 acres of land to prevent further logging. And it's been an uphill battle ever since, with the lands and watersheds undergoing extensive restoration by the park and partners. Management and logging of old-growth redwoods continue on private lands in the vicinity and throughout the Redwood region. But now, only 5% of old-growth redwoods remain. Most of these 100,000 acres of remaining forest are located in various sections of several state, local, and national parks in California. So with that in mind, let's suppose that you'd still like to see what remains of the redwood forests that were lost. Well, you wouldn't have to look far. You just have to find what they were built with. For example, you could visit the Carson Mansion, one of the most famous Victorian structures in California, or the beautiful town of Ferndale, which still retains most of its historic 19th century buildings, especially the beautiful Victorian houses, some of which are now used as bed and breakfast. Because, as I said earlier, what we see today is only a fraction of a much greater forest that has since disappeared. And sadly, it could not have been avoided, as lumber was just as vital to the rise of California as gold. So why have we never heard of the California redwood logging rush? My guess is that the notion wouldn't have been romantic enough to make men risk everything in chasing a dream. Think about it. Federal government propaganda selling rivers of gold, it's just far more romantic. but that's just one hypothesis, and I'd love to hear others in the comment section below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Sokash, signing off.